start on this really kind of like participatory urbanism and creativity, I want to echo what Neil said earlier and the Penang team. He said that money is really important. And I think that's quite true because right after Chiang Mai, that's going to be my new project, getting money from Penang to Kuala Lumpur. But I think in Kuala Lumpur, we have another problem, a bigger problem, I feel, and that's actually what you guys already have in Penang, political will. And what I'll be sharing today is on the sort of reaction that came from the grassroots of creative groups in Kuala Lumpur and then how we took that experience to different cities. So before that, let's demystify some of these big words. What is participatory urbanism and creativity, right? What is participation? Because this is what we tend to see in Kuala Lumpur. There's a lot of money, there's a lot of development, but it seems to come from the top and then it kind of like slowly like channels its way all the way down. And by the time we get it, we have no say in terms of its design, its usage, and how it actually affects our day-to-day life. And you know, in this sort of sense, both in design world and also in architecture and urban planning, it's always top-down. And what basically I'm proposing today isn't so much that we should move this, we should reverse this entirely and you know, let's just do urban planning from the bottom up. What I'm proposing today is, or rather what we have been doing in the past 3 years through Better Cities is that we are proposing a way in which we can multiply the number of players in the field in a way that we can diffuse that decision-making power. So the policymakers, the citizens, the planners, the designers, and the developer, the funding agencies essentially sit within, you know, this sort of spectrum where we can do this very interesting thing where we don't really like in Asia, negotiation. So trying to get as many stakeholders in the same table and making them agents of change. And one of the most important things that we sort of encountered as we're trying to test this out, so this has been an experiment for the past 3 years, is that it involves this thing where we have to convince a stakeholder, is it about process or is it about outcome? And a lot of times, in fact, 10 out of 10 times, a lot of people come back to us and say, no, you don't get the money because we want outcome, we don't want process. And that's why I'm going to come to you, Neil, after this. But before I talk about 2 projects that we have done in the last 3 years, this is a recent article actually, and it sort of quotes Tim Brown on the idea that this is the reality of where cities and you know its disciplines are actually going, that we can no longer predict the outcomes of our action, and therefore planning something as complex as cities is becoming harder and harder. So I don't think the paradigm is about saying top-down is better or bottom-up is better. I think it's the idea of how do we diffuse the system and then democratize it and, you know, allowing more actors to participate. So the idea that the process is actually more important than the outcome. So, so what is Better Cities? And I've been, over the past 3 years, trying to find and refine ways to explain what we do better and better. It's the idea that we're trying to get the people to sort of be able to proactively engage in the creation of their city. Again, I don't come from the background of urban planning or architecture. And the whole initiative sort of came about as a reaction to how things were done in Kuala Lumpur. That we find that we don't have a manner to speak up the way maybe the civic society movement in Penang has sort of been the foundation of how things are done. Or maybe in other cities, like Bandung, for instance, back in my first visit in 2005, where I actually met up with people like Gustav Hariman from Common Room and the BCCF guys, is that in these cities, it seems like the citizens are able to proactively engage what's going on, either contributing in terms of the commerce or the creative activities. So hence, Better Cities sort of started as this idea of how do we explore this bottom-up urbanism and taking what typically happens in this quintessential Malaysian culture, which is what we call the mama culture. So for your information, mama is like a stall that is open 24 hours on the street, and you kind of go there and you eat, and then you complain about everything that you can't change. So the idea was a reaction to, can we actually make change even though it's small? It's a challenge, and but we said, okay, it's got to start somewhere. It's got to come out in bite size. And what we did was that we created sort of like a manifesto, and we distributed that in forms of like very pop culture forms, like button badges, pamphlets, websites, social media. So the idea is to get it to disseminate this sort of this manifesto and this message to as many people as easy as possible. And people kind of like that idea. But we take that further, and we started creating different tracks. And some of these projects are, for instance, a free public talk, where we invite different people to discuss urban issues, not to just continue the discussion or the discourse, but rather to tell people that the idea of city making and its problems and its challenges are something that all of us can have an idea on. So for instance, one of the topics that was explored was looking at what people are doing in suburbs in Kuala Lumpur, so different residential areas, and we realized that there are interesting projects. So we highlight them in order to create that sort of momentum for the rest to follow. So these are some of the talks that we have been running since 2011. There's one on placemaking in urban generation, on transportation, on design, making things happen, on mapping. So what is interesting is, like earlier in one of the presentation you were talking about, Marco, you were talking about the car sharing project. So in KL, similarly, there's one single developer who decided to spend his time to create a car sharing app as well. And another example that was quite successful was a cyclist who decided that the local government in Selangor and KL are talking a lot about building bike lanes, but they're building bike lanes to cater for recreational cyclists rather than commuting cyclists. So this is a clear example of how top-down policy, or that sort of formation of top-down design, that does not take into account the realities that's happening on the bottom up. And this particular project has been quite successful in the sense that the data and the sort of amount of like experience that they have gathered, this guy has made it his sole purpose for the last 2 years to cycle every street in KL with a bunch of volunteers and mapping and grading the different roads in KL, and then presenting that information to the local council. So we sort of use the talk to then share about these different projects, because we are not the only one. And this reaction is growing, and we want to sort of consolidate the effort. So some of the talks here, the more subversive ideas, and the more formal sort of different sort of talks that are happening. We also do projects that sort of, tease our mind or reimagine about what could happen if Kuala Lumpur wasn't run by a bunch of I will not use the word here. But this is actually one of the entries, or one of the concepts that we developed, which also went to the exhibition that Marco was talking about earlier in Berlin by ADIS, which is Smart City. So we were also selected by Berlin to present this particular concept, and it was this idea of basically re-looking at how we can rethink about urban mobility, but also sort of taking a jab on our car policy, because in Malaysia, the car policy is essentially a monopoly, right? And the entire industry has been backed by a lot of public money, but very no incentive to innovate, because it's just is. And so this was a reaction to it. How do we change or transform that business model? So we know it may not happen, but the idea was to force this sort of exercises onto ourselves and the people that we know. So it kind of traveled a few places. It was also featured at Everything Forever Now, which was an event or an exhibition that the British Council organized 2 years ago. What I want to talk about, I only have about 10 minutes to do that, so I'll talk about 2 projects. One project is in KL, and the other project was in Penang. So everything that sort of encapsulates what we have been doing in Better Cities, the idea of bottom-up or emergent urbanism, or what this word that I learned from Marco, which is co-production, right? The idea of many people emphasizing process over outcome. So what are the processes that we want to highlight or emphasize or want to experiment and tackle? So these are the 3 things. On the first one, which is behavior, we started this project very early on in 2011. So we don't have a lot of money. We don't have an avenue or a place, so we don't, yes, we do have networks to go to galleries, but we don't have that avenue to make it big. So what do? We pick bus stops, because bus stop is a public space, and we treated bus stop as a pop-up gallery where we started doing pop-up urban intervention. We went in there and we asked questions like, are you happy with the bus service? Yes, no, a bunch of stickers. Would people respond to that? We took it further, so no approval process by the local council, nothing. We just went in usually after 10 p.m. A bunch of us kind of scurry around, and then, but what we do is that because we were mostly designers, we ensured that the design was impeccable, that in this particular instance, for example, this is at night, yeah? The design stayed there for 3 weeks because the local council thought that it was actually an ad that was in the bus stop. And believe it or not, this bus stop is right opposite KLCC on Jalan Ampang, next to Avenue K. So if you've been to KL, this is prime land. This is the center of like the city center, and it stayed there for a while. And essentially, these are just games for commuters to play because there's so much idle time. And Anda Bosan is a Malay phrase that basically asks, are you bored? And you should be, because in KL, the buses don't come on time. And when it doesn't come on time, you waste a lot of time doing nothing at these public spaces. And these are some of the earlier interventions that we did. We also, for instance, in this case, started distributing seed bombs, which are little mud balls with seed that you can take home and plant. And again, the idea is not that you can change the city through these small intervention, but it's just cheeky ways of responding to what are the issues that we feel strongly about our urban landscape. And the project sort of culminated quite interestingly in the sense that a group of architecture students in a local university decided to incorporate what we did, all this bunch of intervention, into their elective course. And so, Neil, you asked me earlier, what would we do if we have money to give out? So what we did was similar. We actually got a grant, and what we did with the school is we told the kids, the students, that we will cut them up into even smaller micro grants, and each grant is only 200 ringgit, that is less than 100 US dollars, only like slightly more than 50 US dollars, and you have to improve the bus stops around the school in this particular university. So 5 bus stops were selected, and we went through the process with the students over 4 months with only 50 US dollars or slightly more, where they identified the problem, they went through a design process, they then built something. Again, we tried to contact the local council, but they had no response because they were like, I don't know what you guys are doing, I don't know which department I should hand you to. So again, this whole intervention was done without the approval or the acknowledgement of local council. Second one is negotiation. So after 1 year of doing this, we thought, okay, you know what? We need to get out of Kuala Lumpur, right? We need to try this experiment elsewhere. So we decided, hey, why don't we go up north to Penang? Because there's political will, right? And there seems to be a lot of money, right? Not true on the latter, very true on the former. So we didn't get any money from Penang, but we were there prepared already. So we did receive a grant, and we selected a site. And this is an interesting process on negotiation. Why? And I'll show it to you. Because what we did in Penang is that Better Cities designed a week-long urban action workshop. An urban action workshop essentially is we had an open call. We selected 9 creatives, young creatives. There were 7 architects and 2 visual designers. And what happened is that we gave them a challenge brief. We selected a site, which is a back alley in Little India, which looks quite bad. It's not like unusable. There are, people use it, but it looks quite horrid. And it has this very interesting, complex manifestation of cultural negotiation. So on this side is literally an Indian Muslim shop that is, has this greasy like exhaust fan that is kind of churning out really bad gunk. And on the other side is a Hindu, like a person running a shop, and she has like this tree that she considers sacred. And how they negotiate that difference is that they build this ugly zinc wall to sort of divide that. And so we spoke to them, we took time, and the research process took about 3 months. We took time and we asked, like, are you okay if we open up that space, but we make sure that all your issues are still sort of, we'll try to negotiate those issues through design. And in this particular process, why I said there's a lot of negotiation is because we spoke to a lot of local institutions, and a lot of these people are here today. Think City, Georgetown Festival, the local council of Penang, and we spoke to the landlord and the tenants, and this becomes an interesting process because it's very difficult to go to these institutions that have money and experience and tell them that, to be honest, we have designed a workshop, but we are not sure what is the outcome because it's going to be an open, participatory process. And the truth is, our expectation obviously was that it will be smooth sailing, but the reality was that it's not a straightforward journey till the end, till we get approval. But the process forces us as a team, as an initiative, to sort of work with different stakeholders. And this is the process that we are quite committed to. And as you can see, we've done this report to our funders, essentially to say that what we plan or what we expect mapped against reality is quite different. And so this is essentially the sort of multi-stakeholder negotiation that is quite important. The entire project was surprisingly funded by the Finnish embassy, and they were like really nice. They didn't like put any sort of parameters to what we do or how we do it. But the interesting thing about coming back to political will is that the project did happen, and the project happened in ways that I think we would never imagine it would happen in Kuala Lumpur. But it wasn't easy either. But I think that is the reality that we kind of accept as part of doing or exploring this bottom-up urbanism, is that you have to be ready, and a lot of times you have to believe in the process and you decide the parameters. So without, for instance, Think City, we wouldn't have identified the site. That was done in a way that we got access to a prior research that they have already done in Little India. Without Georgetown Festival, for instance, we wouldn't have been able to have gotten the local authorities' approval in record time compared to if we had done that bottom-up entirely. So working with multi-stakeholder in a multi-stakeholder sort of process is quite an interesting process. And that sort of transformed a space into something that, it's not rocket science, or it didn't change, like it's not going to win any architecture award, right? But what we did is that we have selected a site and we have selected a need for that transformation for the residents and also the users there. And that essentially is the process of negotiation. So I have 30 seconds. I want to sort of like round it by talking about the last piece in this whole process thing that we are measuring, which is openness. And this is obviously the toughest challenge that can be measured, because how do you measure openness? And I actually don't have the answer. But it's a work in progress. And I put it as a last point because it is after 3 years of doing this particular experiment that now we are sort of getting the confidence of the smaller local municipal council type of like partnership. So there are actually 2 projects that we're quite happy. I can't actually show you photos because we've just started on those projects. One project involves taking the small urban intervention sort of approach to KL's public housing projects. Essentially, they call it PPR. It's like the HDB in Singapore, but in far worse conditions. And taking this idea that people there can take action and take ownership of that space that they live in and make it into a more livable place. So that's one project, and the other project was actually a research paper to talk about how do we better use public money to redevelop public land. So these are the small steps, but I think the last step is likely the hardest challenge that I don't think I have an answer. So if you do think you have an answer, I'm happy to speak to you after this. And if you have money, and I'm looking at you, Neil, I do want to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So many projects that have done in Malaysia, and